I'll give it another try.
Just tell.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen. Is that man here?
She's on the way. Where's Sam?
Where's what? Well, that's we're going to have no. We'll put Peter. I think we'll put.
Well, should we sit? Do you want to sit? Just that I've got my laptop, so I don't want to stand and hold it.
Oh, yes. Well, you'll have to stand.
So you want to show some slides?
No, I didn't prepare any. I'm just going to speak, but I haven't printed off. Like I'll hold my laptop.
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah, have you got a lectern by any chance? No, that's okay. I can just hold my laptop. It's fine.
Can you stand on the bar?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Hi, Cammi. Yeah, you too. Thanks for having
So I'll
me.
be doing the video.
Okay, all right.
The video will be doing all the rest.
Okay, no worries.
She's driven up from Wollongong. I don't know whether she's driving back there afterwards.
I don't know. Just check.
I'm meeting her at my class, which is just outside. Okay. So she lives in the playground, so she's come to take my little one. Yeah, so I've got an 8-year-old and a 2-year-old. Yeah, we've done it. No, he then took her. She's 8. But you like exactly the same. You've got younger. How is that possible? Yeah. Well, you know, I turned 40 in December and I'm waiting. So I feel like,
Hi Alex, good to see you. No, we never start without you.
There'll be one of these things. So you're putting the quiz mark.
She works very close.
And it's all music.
No, she's on her way now.
Yes, we've sent someone down to help us. So we'll go to about 7:50 down. Testimony. This is more of a hassle than I thought. I haven't got the technical support for turning on the microphone. Hi there. Yeah, she should be.
Just trying to see when we can. Is this the first time you've had lighting problems?
I think it's always been gloomy here, but this is, I thought that could turn it up. I mean, that one's not on.
Right.
I've got a light here that'll lighten up the speakers. But, that's it, I think. Anyway, the technical person now is coming. They send the manager. Let's see if we can do better.
Yeah. Well, there's a light bulb here that's missing.
That's why there's no light. Right. That's probably deliberate. You know, that's what I think they might deliberate. Have you got a number for him?
Yeah, she's on her way.
Hi.
What was the rule about having to be out by 7:30 or by
7:15 will turn the
7:15.
mic off. That will turn the mic off.
Okay.
And the quiz night will start over there. But we can talk.
Yeah.
That's just how noisy they are there. That's why starting at 6 is pretty important.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I'm just waiting.
No, we're not
for
pushing you.
No, we're waiting for Emma.
Yeah. We need the microphone to work as well. So.
Is it not working?
I'm ready to start if, you know.
Yeah, that's good because we will start with you, but I need the sound to be before we can start. Yes. Ah, great, Emma. It's lovely to see you. Come on in.
She says someone's coming up. Good to meet you.
I like it. I can't quite tell, but it looks like it's got long. Yeah. Look,
And we're gonna be 145 minutes.
Yeah.
And
Hi, Mary. Hey, look, we only have meetings in the dark. Oh yeah, you mean I see for the next.
Peter, you're live.
All right, okay. Well, the life of times of Claude, that would be a good topic. Would that be a good topic?
G'day. Thanks.
I'm good to take a propaganda shot of the ladies.
Good.
We have a face on tape.
Yeah.
What a lie.
It's fucking weird. Yeah. We're sort of kicking away, but God knows where it's all going. It's going down. I just started writing something about May Day. I like a global picture. And looking at the actual numbers in the pandemic, we're like 10% or 20% in. It's really a very scary outlook.
I know, I saw that.
I told us running late. It's not 6 o'clock in the morning. The blurb I got.
No, it is.
Oh, that's all.
The actual promos.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
I thought maybe I've gotten the wrong. I'm on the wrong list.
No. Well, unfortunately, the politics in the pub official website is still not live, but all the other emails and promos.
Well, I thought it's probably normally 6:30, but tonight it was 6 because one of the speakers had to run away.
No, it's because of the pub. They run a quiz night on Tuesday nights starting at 7:30.
Hang on.
They just take our microphone off.
I think I was here.
Yeah. Okay.
Try and take a propaganda shot.
What's that?
I'm going to try to take a propaganda shot on the Facebook page.
Oh, yeah. I was going to shut down, didn't you?
Well, one of the
Propaganda shot. You three, over help.
What do you think about the number of the yeah.
Can I take one propaganda shot quickly?
Yeah, yes.
You want to be in this?
No. I think that's great.
We need a flag. Thank you.
Okay, folks. If everybody's got their students and their optimism about Scott Morrison's attitude to climate change. Okay, welcome to Politics in the Pub. It's a long overdue topic tonight, and I'm thrilled to bits that we're going to address the struggle for freedom of the indigenous people of West Papua, which is really my cue to first of all acknowledge the Iora people of the Gadigal Nation, and we acknowledge their stewardship of this part of the world, past, present, and into the future. That's a pretty pertinent observation, given that we're talking about the indigenous people, the fate, the plight of the indigenous people of Papua. The first speaker tonight will be Dr. Emma Kluge, whose doctorate has been about the West Papuans' fight for independence, particularly with respect to the United Nations in the 1960s. And Emma is going on, hopefully, to Italy to look further at the business of decolonization. I'm incredibly envious because it looks as though she's about to go to Florence. Why not stay in Sydney? Never mind. The other speaker is a good friend of mine whom I've watched for quite a few years. Dr. Cammi Webb-Gannon really kept part of the West Papua project alive at Sydney University, then as far as I can tell at University of Western Sydney, and now in the School of Health and Social Sciences at the University of Wollongong. Cammi's doctorate was also on the plight of the West Papuans, but I have been particularly interested in some articles you've written for the conversation, not least one about the use of music and poetry to make some sort of gesture towards the task of West Papuans' sense of healing from the atrocities that they have had to put up with. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'm meant only to be in the chair. Please welcome Emma to. You're going to start.
We're going to do a switcheroo. Sorry. You'll start. Yeah, I'll start and then move on to Emma. That's okay with everyone.
Have you resolved that conflict?
Yeah. Well, we weren't in conflict.
No,
Are you okay? Are you okay with that?
Okay. So you're going to kick off.
Yeah, is that all right?
Okay.
Okay. Now, do I need a microphone for
Yeah,
the recording? Okay.
No.
Well, thanks for having me tonight. It's a privilege to be here, and as Stuart says, any opportunity to keep West Papua on the political radar, on the kind of social conscience of people is an important opportunity. So yeah, I appreciate you coming and I appreciate the opportunity. Imagine this. You're a young man sitting down to a quiet breakfast with your family, and you hear a commotion outside. Suddenly, a group of soldiers armed with rifles bursts into your home, and the men shoulder their way into the kitchen, claiming to be in search of someone, a member of the resistance army, whom they suspect of killing a member of the Indonesian military, and demanding you tell them where the perpetrator is. You have no idea, but you stand up to protect your terrified family, trying to move them out the back door and behind the house to safety. In the process, you are shot in the arm. The bullet crushes your bone. The soldiers continue to the next house in their hunt, leaving you critically injured. Two of your brothers usher you into a waiting truck and rush you to a nearby health centre, seeking emergency treatment for your arm in an attempt to save your arm. Little did you or your brothers know that in attempting to access medical care, you would all die. Members of the military come into the health centre after you arrive. They torture your brothers to death while your brothers wait for you, and then they kill you. Your only crime? Being Indigenous in Indonesian-occupied West Papua. I'm not getting you to imagine a hypothetical situation. On February 15th of this year, 26-year-old Yanius Bagao was shot by the military as they searched for a member of the Papuan Resistance Army who had killed one of their number, by the Indonesian military, I should say. Now, all of this is taking place in the Intan Jaya region of West Papua, which has been subject to a formidable military operation for more than a year. An operation which has caused more than 13,000 West Papuans to be internally displaced, and which has stoked the fire of the resistance movement. Everyone is on high alert, and the Indonesian army suspects all Indigenous West Papuans of harbouring so-called separatist intent, or at least that is how they justify the indiscriminate killings they continue to carry out. Community members carried the wounded Yanios on a makeshift stretcher through the jungle until a pickup truck met them and transported Yanios and his brothers, Justinos, who was 20, and Sonny, who was 16, and my son's name is Sonny, so this story kind of particularly struck me, and Yanios' wife and mother to a health clinic. The military showed up at the clinic. They refused to let the staff treat Yanios, chasing the staff and Yanios' wife and mother away. When a health worker appeared for work the next morning, he found the tortured corpses of the 3 Bagao brothers in bags. They had been murdered in cold blood. There has been no attempt at an investigation of these deaths 2 months down the track. No autopsy was conducted. The head of the Public Relations Department of the Regional Defence Command, which is located, the Indonesian Military Command, located in the Highlands, where the military operation is taking place, declared that the brothers belonged to the Papuan Resistance Army and had tried to escape arrest. There is absolutely no evidence to support his claim. Human rights groups fear this egregious act will be yet another instance in which Indonesian security forces murder with impunity. Now, this is the third time that I've had the honour of speaking at Politics in the Pub, and the third time that I've spoken about the protracted conflict in West Papua. What has changed since the first time? On the one hand, not a lot. In 2012, I stood here, well, actually it was, I think in the Gaelic Club in Surrey Hills, another place, and told the Politics in the Pub audience about a gathering of about 5,000 West Papuans who had met together in 2011 to declare an independent West Papuan state. The Indonesian military had fired into the gathered crowd, killing 7 people. Soldiers then proceeded to beat up the people who had gathered and torture and arrest hundreds of participants. In 2015, I addressed Politics in the Pub referencing the summary killing in broad daylight of West Papuan independence advocate Marco Tubuni by the Indonesian military while he shopped at the market. Events of a similar nature continue to take place in West Papua, and in many instances, the violence has increased. According to the International Coalition for Papua, sorry, Stuart, are you saying I've got 5 minutes left?
No, you're doing fine.
Oh, okay. So according to the International Coalition for Papua, the ICP, at least 1,800 additional military personnel have been deployed to the highlands in West Papua to counter the resistance army.
What's Jake?
As the ICP points out, and I quote,
Hello.
So the ICP points out that the Indonesian government continues to seek a violent resolution to the conflict. Amnesty International has recently released a report about what's been happening in West Papua over the past couple of years, and they've written that 19 cases of unlawful killings by security forces in West Papua and Papua, so they're the 2 provinces that make up the territory of West Papua, have occurred over the past year. Only 4 of the 50 unlawful killing cases that were recorded in Papua between 2018 and 2021 have been brought to military or civilian courts. Okay, so right now I'm quoting from a Jakarta Globe article which summarises the report. They wrote, there are at least 132 cases of freedom of speech violations in the country last year, resulting in the arrest of 157 people, including journalists. From February 2019 to February 2020, 201 human rights defenders and social justice leaders were victims of human rights abuses, either offline and online. Now, this online intimidation took many forms, including credential theft of WhatsApp accounts, spam calls from unidentified international numbers, and digital harassment, such as intrusions during online discussions. And I think it's important to emphasize this shift. Well, it's not necessarily a shift, but kind of an opening up of the sphere of harassment from purely kind of physical intimidation and harassment of physical spaces to the online and digital space, because this is where West Papuans are increasingly gathering to plan and also networking internationally to build support for their decolonisation movement. So I've said that on the one hand, not a lot has changed, but on the other hand, quite a lot has changed since 2012, when I first brought it up to PIP. And this changes the focus of my book, so sorry, a bit of a shameless plug, but it's coming out in a couple of months with the University of Hawaii Press. It's called Morning Star Rising, The Politics of Decolonisation in West Papua, and it's available for pre-order from the French website. But back to my point, how things have changed, or how things are changing in West Papua. Since around 2010, increased unity among the West Papuan leadership and body politic on key political issues is bringing West Papuans ever closer to decolonisation. This is remarkable, given the huge odds faced by Indigenous West Papuans as they oppose Indonesian colonisation. The issues that West Papuans are becoming increasingly united around and which are strengthening the movement include the following. First, there is a cherishing of a common understanding of what the decolonisation of West Papua means. This is really important because in a lot of decolonisation or resistance or advocacy movements, you can have quite a lot of conflict about what the end goals actually are. There's a lot of dissatisfaction, but agreement on goals can be difficult to achieve. But in West Papua, this is becoming increasingly clear. What Papuans want is something which they call merdeka, which translates loosely as freedom from Bahasa Indonesia. Merdeka is a vision of a peaceful, just, and necessarily politically independent West Papua. This dream held in common is perhaps the most powerful force uniting West Papuans today. That the yearning for Merdeka, with its inherent implications of political independence, lies in the hearts of many West Papuans was made abundantly clear to me when I visited the territory in 2008. All over West Papua, from the very elderly man who touched my elbow outside of the police station in Jayapura, West Papua's largest city, and whispered, eyes clouded with cataracts and tears, Papua Merdeka. To my young female friend who, despite her fear of the Indonesian military, was intensely keen on connecting me with active members of the independence movement. To the dreadlocked and imposingly built Papuan resistance army soldier who approached me at a festival in Wamena in the highlands and whispered to me, today it rains, but tomorrow the sun will shine. The desire for Merdeka was palpable. Since 2010, a renewed push for Merdeka has gradually emerged. Thousands, and estimates have ranged up to 50,000 of West Papuans regularly protest across West Papua for a referendum on independence. The Papuan People's Consultative Assembly, which is an all-Papuan upper house, convened in 2010 as part of the upsurge of Merdeka sentiment in Jayapura, demanding a referendum directed towards political independence, and also demanded that the government of the Republic of Indonesia recognise the restoration of the sovereignty of people of West Papua. That's a quote. In 2015, and this is incredibly significant, the United Liberation Movement for West Papua, the ULMWP, was formed from representatives of the three main independence-seeking bodies in West Papua and the diaspora. And this attracted the backing of many countries within the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group of states. Now, the reason I mention this is because West Papuans have been criticised for decades and from organisations and governments around the world for being too factional, for being too divided, for being unable to get their act together, essentially, and for the leadership to be unable to agree on where they want to go and who should lead. For the first time, the major factions have gotten together to form this umbrella organisation, which they've actually now announced in 2020, last year, is an interim government, and they even have a president in waiting. And in what is possibly West Papuans' boldest Merdeka initiative to date, the ULMWP delivered to the United Nations Special Committee on Decolonisation in 2017 a petition. This petition was signed by approximately 1.8 million people that were gathered from across West Papua at great risk to those who signed in support of an independence referendum. So what they want is, and you might hear a bit more about this from Emma, but in 1969, the United Nations was tasked with overseeing a referendum in West Papua in which West Papuans were supposed to choose either independence or annexation with Indonesia. Now, this was a complete sham. Indonesians coerced West Papuans into voting. It was a complete sham. I'll let Emma tell you more about it, but the United Nations turned a blind eye to that. And so what West Papuans want now is a fair referendum that is independently overseen by a third party. So holding fast to this common goal of decolonisation, including independence, has sustained West Papuans through the darkest nights of their dispossession. The second key issue that unites West Papuans is their perception that a genocide campaign is being enacted against them. If they don't achieve independence, Papuans believe Indonesians will oppress Papuan cultures and kill enough West Papuans to the extent that Papuans are rendered absolutely powerless and become an abject minority. West Papuans recognise genocidal patterns in their treatment by Indonesian political and military institutions, and leading West Papuan activist Marcus Haluk says of this perception of a genocidal campaign, there are many ways and forms of abuse and elimination of Papuans. First, by stigmatising and linking cases with separatism. So this harks back to what I was talking about at the beginning. Indonesian soldiers just call all West Papua, Indigenous West Papuans separatists, and then feel or can justify their targeting of civilians. And then they participate in direct killings, the equivalent of slaughtering animals. Colonial subjugation takes many forms through family planning. Why not in Java? Assimilation, forced marriages, transmigration, and exclusion of Papuans from jobs. Even public service positions are dominated by the military. There are also massacres. Now, special autonomy, which is a law that the Indonesian government's approved, in which a whole lot of money is essentially sent back into West Papua, and then the Indonesian government can say, well, look, we're trying to develop the province, but actually nothing of value is being implemented in West Papua. So Marcus Haluk says special autonomy is another form of subjugation through money. Local officials are allocated so much money, they have lost their integrity and dignity. So that's the end of my quote from Marcus, but fear of genocide is a catalyst for the active and increasing resistance against Indonesian authority. To the minds of many, independence is the only possible future they can contemplate. The alternative is their own demise. The third issue uniting Papuans is the firming up of a globally performed West Papuan cultural and national identity. And so this is what Stuart was referring to. So there's a huge grassroots movement among West Papuans and supporting artists from Melanesia around performing West Papuanness. This has been critical to establishing Indigenous pride in place and culture. And this has deeply involved West Papuans, not only within West Papua, but also in the diaspora. Through the expression of culture, so through the expression through song and dance of being West Papuan, political dissent is temporarily overcome. So you no longer have the conflicts during these performances of identity, the conflicts of who belongs to what faction or which place, And it, you temporarily see an overcoming of long-standing factionalism and dissent, particularly between Papuans who have stayed in country and those who have decided, because they're refugees or they have decided to leave for political purposes. There's a lot of conflict and resentment around between the kind of two populations. And so this is temporarily overcome as Papuans around the world and Papuans within West Papua kind of create these performances of West Papuanness, which unite them across national borders. For example, in Papua New Guinea, a funeral for an influential West Papuan refugee and student at the University of Papua New Guinea was held on the university's campus and was attended by many of the conflicting West Papuan diaspora groups. They performed songs from around West Papua and carried the West Papuan flag in the funeral procession together. The Indonesian government had asked the PNG Prime Minister at the time, Michael Somare, to cancel the funeral because it feared the impact that the show of West Papuan nationalism would have on people watching. Somare refused. He said, not even I, as Prime Minister of the country, can stop a funeral from taking place. West Papuans wield the performance of culture as a weapon to counter cultural genocide and use it to connect politically competing West Papuan factions at home and abroad.
I'm not sure.
The fourth issue, and I'm only doing 5 issues, so relax, it's okay. The fourth issue that is uniting West Papuans is the agreement for the first time since the 1960s among the 3 broad generations of West Papuan resistance and the major strategic factions upon the push for an internationally supervised referendum for independence as the most promising path towards decolonisation. So you've seen since the 60s a whole lot of different strategies put forward. In the 60s, many in the resistance struggle fought the Indonesians with weapons. They formed a guerrilla army, which is still active today, but has little strength compared to the Indonesian military. In the 70s and 80s, resistance leaders leaned towards a diplomacy approach, appealing to governments around the world for support, and in the end weren't very successful. In the 1990s and 2000s, some leaders sought out peaceful dialogue with Indonesia, which Indonesia never came to the table for, and others thought that the Indonesian special autonomy law, which I briefly described before, would eventually bring about decolonisation. Each of these strategies was backed by different factions and by different generations. So what is remarkable is that in 2014, with the establishment of the United Liberation Movement for West Papua, which I've also briefly mentioned, with the establishment of this group, the movement has become more cohesive than ever, and they've all backed the strategy, or almost everyone. I mean, there's never complete consensus, right? But almost everyone is backing the strategy of pushing for an international referendum, or an internationally overseen referendum for independence. So that is hugely significant again. Now, finally, the 5th issue that's contributing to the progress of the decolonisation movement and its increasing strength is the solidarity it is gaining from Black and Indigenous peoples across the Pacific and beyond. This is corresponding with a grassroots renaissance of support from civil society across Melanesia, from church groups, women's groups, climate change groups, Indigenous rights groups, and artists and musicians joining the cause for decolonising West Papua. Over the past couple of years, we've seen the rise of hashtag Papuan Lives Matter, which has gained strength and kind of, I guess, piggybacked on, also contributed to the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement originating in the US. Aligning itself with Black and Indigenous politics and peoples globally and making strategic use of social media to network internationally has given the Papuan movement increased international exposure and brought new allies to the cause. And this has helped to boost the movement's profile internationally exponentially. So in conclusion, what West Papuans have shown over the nearly 6 decades they have been working towards decolonisation and an independent state is that no matter how beleaguered they become, they are ever hopeful. And if independence and more comprehensive decolonisation do lie ahead, West Papuans have shown that they are ready to take on the challenges. The agency and determination that has driven the movement against all odds has come from within the West Papuan body politic. The movement has had next to no support from most countries in the world until recently. So I now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Emma Kluge, who will tell you more about the origins of the resistance movement and the early development of the West Papuan Never Say Die spirit. But actually, I'll hand over to Stuart and then Emma.
Look, I just want to say, in honour of Cammi for being able to, I move a motion that we buy a lectern to honour the fact that she can hold her laptop and a microphone and speak coherently all at the same time. So if you come back, I mean, I promise you there'll be a lecture here.
Half an
And
hour.
now please welcome another brilliant young academic who is a decolonizer in motion, Emma Kluge.
Thank you, everyone. It's kind of rare that as a historian I get invited to these events. So thanks Cammi and Stuart for inviting me along. And I hope that through exploring this history, you'll see the relevance of the history of the 1960s and also the way we talk about the history of the 1960s to the ongoing debates about West Papua and also to the strategies that are currently being employed by activists today. So as Stuart mentioned, I recently finished my PhD at the University of Sydney. I'm currently working as a senior research fellow and will also be starting a postdoc at the end of the year. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here and to talk about West Papua, and I also just want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose lands we meet today.
Hello.
I also want to acknowledge any West Papuans who might be joining us in person or online, and the ongoing struggle for independence for West Papua. I'm grateful to be able to share in this history and in the struggle. So today I'm going to talk about my research on the West Papuan independence campaign to the United Nations in the 1960s, which is the focus of my PhD and hopefully my first book. I'm guessing many of you are familiar with the history of West Papua, but I always like to start with a quick overview just to make sure we're on the same page. So when I talk about West Papua, I'm referring to the western half of the island of New Guinea, which borders Papua New Guinea. It's now been divided into two administrative units of West Papua and Papua, but I refer to the whole west half of the island as West Papua, which is how it was named during the period I study, or referred to during the period I study, and how it's referred to by activists today. So during the 1950s, West Papua was under Dutch colonial control. And after the Dutch lost the rest of their Indonesian empire, they turned their focus to the territory of what was then called West New Guinea and began to facilitate a process of decolonization to make West Papua independent. West Papuan leaders took this opportunity and these opening up of positions in government and in administration to launch their own campaign for independence, which culminated in the 1960s. During this time, they formed a Papuan National Congress and conducted flag-raising ceremonies, raising their national flag and singing their national anthem. This process of nationalisation was then interrupted by Indonesia, who claimed the territory belonged as part of its republic.
That's like a 5-year-old.
In 1962, Indonesia leveraged Cold War politics to gain US support and then forced the Netherlands into negotiations, which resulted in the territory being transferred to Indonesian control. West Papua was finally incorporated into the Indonesian Republic in 1969 after the so-called Act of Free Choice. While this vote was meant to allow for West Papuan population to choose whether or not to remain part of Indonesia, the process was tightly controlled so that only just over 1,000 handpicked individuals were allowed to vote, and only one outcome was allowed: the incorporation of West Papua into the Indonesian Republic. The sovereignty of this territory, as Cammi's outlined, is still contested to this day, with many activists arguing that the West Papuan people should be given the right to an internationally supervised referendum, where, unlike in the Act of Free Choice, they are actually given the opportunity to vote on the future of their territory. So in the 1960s, are referenced, 3 moments are usually highlighted: the West Papuan flag-raising ceremonies in 1961, the New York Agreement in 1962, and the Act of Free Choice in 1969, moments that I just talked about in my background. And arguments are usually mobilized about the legitimacy of these events and agreements and their comparative significance to the modern conflict. However, there is a risk that by focusing on just these moments, we can erase all that occurs in between them, and that the history of the 1960s is interpreted only through the lens of trying to argue against the legitimacy of the Act of Free Choice. This framing also sets up the New York Agreement as something that supersedes West Papuan sovereignty and as the arbiter of West Papuan rights. And in doing so, it further legitimizes UN and Indonesian control. A focus on these moments also tends to marginalise West Papuan voices. While West Papuan nationalists were the instigators in the flag-raising ceremonies, they were marginalised at both the signing of the agreement and during the act of free choice. So if we look only at the documents relating to these things, then we lose a sense of their voices and a sense of what their campaign was and what their aims were. So the driving questions of my research were, what would it look like to study the 1960s through the lens of the West Papuan people? Rather than assessing the legitimacy of Indonesia's control, the New York Agreement or the Act of Free Choice, I wanted to focus on the development of the West Papuan campaign for independence, how a small nationalist movement was transformed into a transnational campaign for independence. I wanted to get a sense of how West Papuans would narrate this history, or at least how this history might differ if West Papuans were the central protagonist in the narrative. How did they frame their struggle? What were the strategies of the campaign? And additionally, I wanted to connect up the West Papuan campaign with the broader international context of anti-colonialism and the Black International. So how did I come to this approach? The reason I might maybe that I'm so interested in the ideas of the West Papuan campaign is because I came to this struggle and to West Papua in a rather unusual way. Rather than learning about the West Papuan struggle through the activist campaign or politics, I was introduced to the struggle in the reading room of the National Archives of Australia in Canberra during my honours year in 2015. If any of you have been to the National Archives, you'll know this is a very strange place to be radicalised. Or maybe not, maybe reading government files radicalises. In studying Australia's refugee history, I came across a mention of West Papuan refugees in Papua New Guinea during the 1960s, which led me to a collection of case files in the archives. As I followed the stories of these West Papuans, I was introduced to the West Papuan campaign for independence. In the application for permissive residence in Papua New Guinea, West Papuan refugees were given the opportunity to make a personal statement that would be included in their applications. One of the first applications I read was this one from Dale Kadam, who sought refuge in Papua New Guinea in 1969. And I'm just going to quote an excerpt here. I decided to withdraw with my family to the territory of Papua New Guinea. Reasons. All political figures and organisations have had consultations to ask the Indonesian government to guarantee freedom of political action, party activity and assembly. But after this was heard, leaked, there were wild arrests, killings and shootings put into action by the Indonesian armed forces, suffering in and out of prison and property looted and stolen by the Indonesian army. For me personally and comrades in arms, 30,000 West Papuans, ordinary people, have been casualties. 1963 until 1969 has become a matter for us all. End quote. Kadam's statement and his file recorded his experiences in West Papua. He was imprisoned by the Indonesian military and sought refuge in Papua New Guinea because he feared Indonesian retaliation as a result of his involvement with the West Papuan resistance movement, the OPM. Reading the personal statements of West Papuans like Kadam, I was brought into their struggle for independence. As the West Papuans described their suffering under Indonesian colonialism and the desires for the future of West Papua, I became invested in this story and in their struggle. Their words radicalised me and changed the direction of my life. After my honours year, I wanted to know more about West Papua, so I decided to continue on to do a PhD so I could dig deeper into the history of West Papuan independence campaign. I was particularly interested in their campaign to the United Nations, since this was an ongoing strategy of West Papuan activists. Yet I was frustrated with how many academic histories of West Papua in the 1960s tended to sideline West Papuan voices. West Papuan actors were there, but they were often the objects of debate rather than the subjects. So often West Papuans were referenced only in relation to the Netherlands or Indonesia, or the resistance movement was used as background detail to explain the challenges faced by the UN mission in negotiating the conflict. I knew West Papuans campaigned to the United Nations during this time, so I went searching for more direct access to the campaign at the UN archives in New York. To my surprise, I found files literally labelled petitions, which contained hundreds of letters written by West Papuans during the 1960s. These files are in the footnotes of other accounts, but only mentioned in passing. Few historians ever quoted from them or took the time to dig into their meaning. In these petitions, a whole world of West Papuan ideas opened up to me. Ideas that both fleshed out and challenged the dominant historical narratives about West Papua in the 1960s. Yet using the UN archives came with its own challenges and raised many questions for me methodologically. What did it mean to study the West Papuan campaign for independence using the archives of the United Nations? The UN was directly involved in handing the territory over to Indonesia. How would this influence the story that was represented in the archives and the perspectives that were recorded? The UN archives are almost overwhelming in their detail about West Papua in the 1960s. The issue of the future of West Papua was debated at the UN General Assembly. The United Nations actually administered the territory for a short period over 1962 to 1963, and the UN returned to the territory in 1968 and stayed through to 1969 to conduct the Act of Free Choice. There were pages and pages of reports from UN representatives who went to West Papua over these years. The UN archives provided a compelling counter-narrative to the one I had set out to write, drawing me into the logic of the UN and a longer path already well-trodden, assessing the significance of the UN and the validity of the New York Agreement and the Act of Free Choice in determining the future of West Papua. If you were to go through all the previous versions of my thesis, you would see many copies where I got sidetracked by these archives, long passages on the debates between the Netherlands and Indonesia at the UN, and pages dissecting the effectiveness of the UN administration, and long expositions on the UN's role in overseeing Indonesia's miscarriage of justice in the lead up to the Act of Free Choice. While these things are all important, this was not the history that I was trying to follow and not how I wanted to contextualize the petitions of West Papuans. To resist this logic, I drilled deeper into the experience of West Papuan individuals and communities. So in order to study the West Papuan campaign for independence to the United Nations from a West Papuan perspective, I needed to reconstitute the West Papuan archive. I collected this archive by following the lives of West Papuans to Papua New Guinea, the Netherlands, and the United Nations in New York. Here I returned to the case files of West Papuan refugees in Papua New Guinea. I conducted oral history interviews with the descendants of West Papuan activists in Papua New Guinea and the Netherlands, and sought out sources written by West Papuans and collected quotes of West Papuans from other scholarly accounts. This journey took me all around the world and was only facilitated by the privileged access to resources that I enjoyed as an Australian scholar at a well-funded university. Getting to know the different communities of West Papuan activists was particularly important to me to help understand the significance of this period and how to frame the West Papuan campaign in the 1960s. I was lucky to get to conduct interviews with the descendants of the West Papuans who sent petitions in the 1960s. And through these interviews, I got a sense of the lives of the West Papuan activists, their motivation, and also their ongoing legacies to the modern movement. So what does this West Papuan archive tell us about the West Papuan campaign for independence in the 1960s? So while the West Papuan campaign that I studied was conducted at the United Nations by activists all around the world, it had its roots in the nationalist movement in the 1950s and early 1960s. The leaders involved in the nationalist campaign in the early 1960s then became the West Papuan activists in exile in the Netherlands and Papua New Guinea. The platform they expressed in 1961 in the flag-raising ceremonies was then developed and transformed into an international campaign after the signing of the New York Agreement in 1962. After this point, the movement was fractured, primarily across West Papua, Papua New Guinea, and the Netherlands, meaning that West Papuan activists had to develop transnational networks to continue their campaign. And this was pre-internet. There was a surprising synergy between these locations, despite the challenges they faced as a result of Indonesian persecution in the territory and Australian obstruction in Papua New Guinea. The key strategies of the West Papuan campaign were record keeping, awareness raising, and petitioning. And I'm speaking here of the campaign to the United Nations. As Cammi mentioned, there was also a military campaign within the territory. They linked their struggle to the rights discourse of the UN, appealing to the New York Agreement, which was signed between the Netherlands and Indonesia, as well as the UN Charter and the 1960 Decolonisation Declaration. And they were particularly interested in the principle of self-determination and how that applied to West Papuans. And they combined all this with the language of race. They appealed to African leaders as their brothers and sisters, using the idea of a shared racial identity and shared racial oppression, while also claiming a unique right to land on the basis of indigeneity. The strategies of the West Papuan Transnational Network changed over the 1960s in response to local events. After Indonesia left the UN in January 1965, they focused on record keeping and reporting information to the UN now that there were no longer any UN officials in the region. Once Indonesia rejoined the UN in 1966 and announced that it was going to conduct the stated act of free choice, the West Papuans then turned their campaign to focusing on addressing problems in the territory and focusing on making sure that as many West Papuans as possible would get to vote in this act. When the United Nations then returned to West Papua in 1968 to oversee the preparations for this vote, both local and diasporic activists intensified their campaign. The diasporic activists appealed to UN delegates in New York, taking meetings with the UN officers and UN delegates, trying to explain to them the political awareness that existed in West Papua and that West Papuans had, in fact, participated in democratic elections before. While local activists delivered petitions to the UN officers in West Papua, once again trying to prove their political awareness and also drawing attention to the way in which the Indonesian military was suppressing their rights to political expression and political organisation. Those in Papua New Guinea often buried information between the two groups, getting out stories of resistance and oppression when the Indonesian military or the media had tried to suppress this information. During the voting process, which took place over about 6 months, West Papuan activists staged demonstrations and uprisings in the territory to disrupt Indonesian narratives about a lack of West Papuan political engagement and get the attention of foreign observers. Through their petitioning and the local and international campaigns supported one another. When viewed through this lens of following West Papuan petitioning rather than analysing actions of the UN, the highly politicised and controlled nature of the act of free choice becomes even clearer and is laid bare for what it is, an elaborately staged performance. During what was called the act of free choice, which was a series of votes, Indonesia decided to conduct the vote through what it called musyawarah, which is consultative voting, which meant that only pre-selected representatives of the community got to participate in this vote. So none of these community leaders or activists were ever allowed to participate in the vote. Like I said, just over 1,000 hand-picked individuals participated. Unsurprisingly, they voted unanimously in favour of remaining part of the Indonesian Republic. And this is also a function of consultative decision-making. At the end of the consultation, you either all agree or all disagree. So there's not really any room for dissension. So to play devil's advocate to my own work, what is the point of focusing on the West Papuan campaign in the 1960s if their aims were never achieved? Does this campaign have any significance outside of the history of West Papua? Well, I argue that West Papuans did not have the opportunity to express themselves in the act of free choice. Their campaign was still highly effective at disrupting Indonesia's narratives about West Papua. They drew attention to the widespread political awareness amongst the population and to West Papuan opposition to Indonesian rule. While Indonesia had hoped to quietly conduct the act of free choice that would incorporate the territory into its republic, the formation of the transnational West Papuan independence campaign complicated this. Diasporic activists gained a lot of support at the UN, which generated considerable criticism towards Indonesia's approach to the act of free choice. While the outcome may seem inevitable now, at no point was it a given that the act of free choice would be accepted by the United Nations. West Papuan activists abroad had garnered so much support from African delegates that the UN administrator feared the vote would not be accepted by the UN General Assembly. Once the act concluded, Indonesia still had to struggle to get it through the General Assembly. The initial assembly was actually delayed because African delegates wanted to study the report on the act of free choice and wanted to consult with West Papuan activists. Then, in the General Assembly debate, UN delegates spoke up for the right of self-determination for West Papuans. While the act was meant to pass quickly through the UN, this debate spanned over a whole day and turned into a debate about the larger stakes of self-determination and decolonisation. The West Papuan campaign disrupted the Afro-Asian power plot and generated questions about international law and its application to their situation. While the Assembly eventually conceded to taking note of the act of free choice as fulfilling the New York Agreement in 1969, everyone in the room was aware of the West Papuan nationalist campaign. The debate was significantly different than the 1962 session, when the New York Agreement was initially accepted. This debate had mainly discussed the agreement as settling a dispute between the Netherlands and Indonesia. There was no mention of an Indigenous population and of Indigenous nationalist movement. Yet in 1969, all the UN delegates clearly acknowledged the West Papuans as a competing party in the dispute over the territory. While Indonesia managed to have its way due to its resources, its willingness to resort to violence, and due to the geopolitical expediency of allowing Indonesia to retain possession of West Papua, this movement of West Papuan activists made the world pay attention and marked their claim in this forum of international governance. So to conclude, studying the 1960s from the perspective of West Papuan people is important because it reframes the central event of this period as a formation of a transnational campaign for independence. This focus is important because it draws attention to the ideas and the strategies of West Papuan campaigners. In doing so, it provides a richer history of the present-day West Papuan campaign to the UN and provides a starting point for more people-focused histories of West Papua and the UN. It also disrupts narratives about the inevitability of Indonesian control and points us towards the hope for the future, listening to the voices of West Papuans. Thank you.
I'm not surprised that you gained a very significant doctoral degree, Emma. Congratulations. Thank you.
Okay, we've got 20 minutes for questions to Cammi. And on the first question, Jefferson. Question, not a statement.
Thanks very much to both of those presentations. Look forward to buying the book from the University of Hawaii Press, and I can give you the money in advance tonight, which is what I did with John Martinkus's The Long Road little book. Now, there are two big issues here. One is Emma's uncovering of all these 61 to 69 archives is a most invaluable service to the ongoing current struggle to point out what happened in the past. And my question to you is, are you aware, particularly in places like East Timor and the Netherlands, there is an attempt to not only talk about the West Papuan independence struggle, but that of the adjoining Indonesian islands, which were declared independent declared themselves independent back in 1949. I just can't remember the name that describes them. That's my question to you. And my question to the other wonderful speaker is, I spoke to a military intelligence retired army guy last week, and he said the missing dimension in the West Papua debate is the fact that the two superpowers are focusing, China and the US are focusing on Indonesia as the key bulwark for the defence of Australia and defence of Asia and from the US, with the new base in Manus Island and so on and so forth. Indonesia's military has expanded about 10 times with aircraft and submarines that'll make any OPM struggle on the ground totally meaningless because of the sophisticated technology, drones and everything else that the Indonesians can now employ.
Okay, Emma, do you want to go first?
Here's the mic.
So I'm guessing, are you talking about the kind of context of the West Papuan campaign, but with other groups of people who are seeking independence?
It's not the Dutch Antilles. What's that group of islands?
Suriname,
No,
Maluka.
the Moluccas Islands.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
have their own flag. They were declared
Yeah, yeah.
independent.
Yes,
Does that confuse the issue on West Papua, or does that add?
I think in the Netherlands, some of the activists I spoke to in the Netherlands when the West Papuans came there, a lot of people were confused and thought they were from the Moluccas. And so I know that there were some groups in the Netherlands that tried to campaign on the part of both peoples, but the West Papuan peoples were very reluctant to have West Papua kind of combined with any other struggle because they believed they had a unique case. And because of the New York Agreement and that the way that act of self-determination was enshrined within it, they didn't want that confused with kind of this broader campaign. And they were also worried that if Indonesia thought that the West Papuan campaign would also threaten other cessation movements, that their campaign would be less effective. So West Papuans didn't necessarily build on those campaigns, but definitely now, I know now, speaking to people in the Netherlands, there is this sense of solidarity with different
Melanesian solidarity.
yeah, Melanesian, and also just those who face kind of Indonesian colonialism. So I think those in East Timor.
Independence. They declared independence like Aceh
Yeah.
long before when the Dutch were pulling out. That's why they recognize.
Yeah, so there's this kind of shared experience of an opposition to Indonesian colonialism. So yeah, that definitely exists. Yeah.
Can I just add to Emma's answer? So traditionally, during the Dutch occupation of West Papua, which was prior to Indonesian occupation, the Dutch brought in civil servants and a kind of middle administration from the Moluccan Islands to administer West Papua. So there's a long-standing resentment from West Papuans towards Moluccan people, which is kind of yet to be overcome, but also I think, like so Emma's spoken to some of the same people I've spoken to in the Netherlands, there's this real sense now of kind of confusion but amusement from West Papuans who are saying, wow, the Moluccan people here are trying to kind of not cash in, on what we're doing, but trying to kind of say that we're Melanesian as well. And she said it used to be that Melanesian was a dirty word, but now it's like this kind of trendy, cool thing that's taking on a new character, and that's quite interesting.
Just superpowers.
So in relation to the superpowers, I mean, look, if you're talking about the TPN-OPM, which is the West Papuan guerrilla struggle, they have no real military might on the ground. I don't know how many soldiers there are. It's up for debate. People go in and out of, kind of belonging to the guerrilla armies. And what's really important, though, is that almost all West Papuans will say, we are OPM. We belong to the OPM. That doesn't mean that they'll take up arms, because the struggle is and has been for probably 15 years now, predominantly a non-violent struggle. The Indonesian military is hugely powerful, and the guerrilla army has no hope in terms of kind of military might of defeating or even standing up to the Indonesian army. But what is significant about it is the fact that it exists is a morale booster for West Papuans. They say, this is our weapons, and violence is our means of last resort. But also what it does is it keeps the Indonesian military on its toes in the highlands, and it's keeping this occupation going in a way. But also, so when the international media and the local media reports on what the guerrilla army is doing, it's keeping the story in the media. It's keeping the resistance alive on a different level than in terms of kind of diplomacy and activism from a civil society non-violent way. And so it's kind of two stories going along together.
Sorry, you missed my main point.
Oh, sorry.
West Papua cannot become independent like East Timor was, because West Papua independence struggle would create a vacuum politically which China, Australia, Indonesia and America will not allow to happen in 2021. Duterte even threatened to move naval boats against 1,000 Chinese ships in the South Pacific yesterday. This is the point. West Papua can't become independent because of the push from the big powers everywhere in 2021. That's my point.
Oh, I mean, Possibly, but international politics are constantly shifting.
Yeah.
Now, you never know what's going to happen. No one ever expected that East Timor was going to become independent. We just can't tell what the future holds.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's another analogy with it. Question from the back. Gentleman from the back.
Thank you for your talk. It's an interesting thing that you study the perspective of history, because I like to share what I feel. I think the whole problem is we are imposing a kind of Jura Regalia doctrine with regard to nationhood on Poland's, when indigenous peoples had a different idea from Europe, which is more like akin to usufruct. Don't you think that perhaps that difference in perceiving what nationhood and society means should be fleshed out, so that we can actually say, okay, so for West Papua, nationhood means this outside, and it's not anymore imposed from by the traditional line of Jura Regalia, which is it's the state that grants you the right to own the land. Rather, instead, acknowledge the West Papuans' idea that the land owns them. Nobody can own the land. What do you think of that?
Yeah, thank you so much for your comment and question. And that's part of what I talked about in my PhD, is the different ideas that West Papuans had about what the future of their territory would look like. For many West Papuans, they kind of maybe imagined a New Guinea federation, and then also like ideas that are now common now, these ideas of this Melanesian socialism and kind of this united sense of being Melanesian and being in the region that didn't necessarily confine to nationhood. It was really Indonesia's competing claims that kind of confined the West Papuan claims to nationhood in terms of a state, because at the time the UN was kind of drawing the boundaries and saying this is the kind of unit of international society, like we're the United Nations, like everyone has to be part of a nation, and so that they kind of confined the potential of decolonization to a state. That's not necessarily what West Papuan peoples or the indigenous peoples would have wanted, but it was either kind of articulate your claims in the form of a state or be submerged into the Indonesian Republic. So that's definitely part of the kind of being forced to fit themselves into these international structures. And yeah, like you said, there are so many different ways of perceiving what it would mean to be independent, but a lot of that, as Cammi talked about, while the Indonesian government is suppressing West Papuan rights, while their lives are being taken, there is no chance for them to kind of have these different expressions because there's just no freedom. And so a lot of those ideas and those imaginings can only start once there is a level of freedom and kind of that opportunity to choose in West Papua. Yeah. Okay.
Another question. Yep.
Listen, I didn't go to the 2012, 2014 talks.
Can you speak up a bit closer to the mic?
I didn't go to the talks 2012, 2014. So could you clarify the interactions between for example, like you mentioned, the Lucans or the Melanesians. What's the interaction between the Western Papuan communities with Papua New Guinea? For example, is there any chance of them being united as a unified entity as opposed to being two parts, different, like going different directions? And on top of that, the little things I do know about Papua New Guinea, there's a quarter of the world's languages and communities actually based in that part of the world. Some of them work together, sometimes they have their own conflicts and they're at each other's throats. How is that parallel to what's happening in West Papua? And as they start to become now more united, are they sort of uniform in their views in terms of having their own separate state, or are they also being pegged one against the other by international players so that actually they have a voice as opposed to having a unified voice that actually stand beyond the international politics? Would you clarify on that, please?
Right, thanks for the questions, great questions. As to whether West Papua and PNG might ever become one, absolutely not going to happen. PNG has been an independent nation state since 1975. There's been a very, very different colonial history between both halves of the island. As Emma was saying, there used to be a vision for a united New Guinea island or even a united Melanesian federation. Those dreams have, died out after the 60s and 70s. West Papuans no longer necessarily want to merge with Papua New Guinea, and Papua New Guineans don't want to merge with West Papuans or with the West Papuan nation state. It's interesting that you do mention kind of the myriad problems that have plagued Papua New Guinea and its statehood, and those problems would, there's corruption, there's mining, there's violent, kind of endemic violence against women, there's lack of infrastructure, there's a huge variety of languages and quite, incredible terrain and geography that, people need to kind of build over to be able to communicate. So a lot of those do kind of apply to the other half of the island, but what is interesting in West Papua is that because of the history of opposition to Indonesians, there's much more of a cohesive national cultural kind of sensibility that's holding West Papuans together, and that doesn't include Papua New Guineans. Now, the Papua New Guinean successive governments have never really supported independence for West Papua. They share a border with Indonesia on West Papua. However, the civil society support in Papua New Guinea is very strong for West Papuans. People recognise that this artificial border that is drawn through the island separates families, and so there's a lot of interaction and border crossing.
And Melanesian too, right? That's also been right. That's the United
Kingdom. Is there the same kind of inter-ethnic rivalry and factionalism within West Papua as there is in PNG? Absolutely. But if you look at political movements all around the world, there's factionalism within them all. It's just going to take time to overcome these. What's significant over the past 10 years about the West Papuan independence movement is the extent of unity, which has been built under the United Liberation for West Papua since 2014. It's never been seen before. Sorry.
Okay, this will have to be the last question, Frank.
What can we in Australia do that might be useful?
Not radical questions. I'm totally out of order, Frank.
Can I just hand the mic over to Joe Collins? Look, Joe is probably, and Anne, together, they're one of probably the two most formidable non-Papuan activists and advocates for decolonisation in West Papua in Australia. So my book is dedicated to them, amongst other people, because it's impossible to be activists for West Papua in Australia without them. Join Anne and Joe's, it's not their group, it's the Australia West Papua Association, but Joe moderates the email list and is a significant player in the governance. I don't know, or the organisation at least. Yeah, Joe, can you give us a few suggestions here, and then I'll add on to that if I can think of anything else.
When's the next demo?
Yeah, this is your guy.
Actually, not just quickly take up the point that Jeffrey mentioned about, the global situation, and this is a bit of a statement. I was just reading an article from Foreign Affairs magazine from Moscow, obviously in English, and it was a really good paper on West Papua. Why Moscow be interested, I'm not sure. But anyway, the bottom conclusion, just a couple of sentences, was the situation on West Papua will remain the same unless unless a regional power decides to change it. And I just have to see that many welcomed China's help. And I think there's only one global power that might be interested in changing the situation in West Papua, and that might be China. And China and Indonesia don't get on very well. It might not be the greatest thing in the world, but Anyway, but that's just a thing to think about. But when I think about what can we do for West Papua, obviously is the usual stuff, and any activists will do, from wearing a t-shirt to talking to people, forming as a group. But in relation, we try to obviously influence the Australian government, and that's a lost cause. The DFAT Australian, they are not interested in us, well, they're interested in West Papua, but they don't want to know about it. They've got a real blind spot on the issue of West Papua. But it's worth just writing to them anyway, because it annoys them. They get very irritated. And the more people that actually, I know people might say writing a letter doesn't count much, but the more people that write, the more they'll realise that there's a lot of interest in the population about the issue of West Papua. But that's not a bad start. Obviously, during COVID, I guess there's been less rallies than there normally is. But hopefully, there has been a few, but it's very hard to get a major rally going on the issue of West Papua. So what we do is we link into international days of importance, like Human Rights Day, December the 10th, May Day. There's always a good chance to have a contingent of a lot of West Papuan flags flying. All these small issues that everybody knows what you can do. It's basically about the best you can do. As I say, DFAT, the government is totally hopeless. They're not going to want to do anything. And actually, Cammi and Jim Emsley and myself, we put in a submission on the what's it called again? The Senate inquiry into Australia's defence relationship to the Pacific Islands. So we put in a submission saying that we believe that West Papua was part of the Pacific, gave all the reasons why Australia should take look at it, and this help solve the problems before it got out of hand. Of course, they just put out the report, and it's not one word mention of West Papua. So they've got a real blind spot about it. And I think maybe Benny Randall with China has probably done more to frighten the Australian government into thinking maybe, just maybe, we might do something, even if it's just to try and convince the Indonesians to stop committing human rights abuses. But anyway, but write lots of letters, it helps.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say one more thing. Thank you both. You were just terrific. And when you talked about Merdeka, it reminded me of in the Uluru Statement when they refer to sovereignty as a sort of a quality which perhaps we are unable to understand. We can't understand the sense of being and cooperation in the world. And I think from a practical point of view, Australian Indigenous people and the South Sea Islanders have been terrific on West Papua.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, what's also hopeful is about the identity of West Papuans with the struggle of the Palestinian people. There's a huge analogy, a huge common ground there. We could pursue Joffre's interesting question about that. But look, somebody referred to DFAT and the Labour Party a couple of minutes ago, and in 2 weeks' time, the topic for politics in the pub is Labour Party leadership, real or imagined? I'm not going to answer, that's just a rhetorical question. But look, Anne's already said that Cammi and Emma were terrific. And I totally endorse that, and I'm sure we do, and express our thanks to you both for keeping this cause alive.
Thanks to Stuart too, because well,
Yeah. Sorry.
before I went to CPACs because of Stuart putting the West Papua campaign on the kind of political agenda at CPACs, the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies. So that's where I did my PhD under the supervision of Wendy Lamborn as well. So I should say there are quite a few people in here keeping the struggle alive, from a non-Indigenous point of view. But yeah, I think, thanks to Stuart for putting it on the agenda here again and again.
Yeah, again and again. So we'll invite these two back to tell in a year's time to say whether anything has changed. But reference to Wendy and the students at Sydney University is not unimportant. The fact that students or former students like Cammi and Emma can carry the banner and slowly replace Joe and Anne. Okay, but look, thank you all for coming. That was a very significant, invaluable evening.
Lastly, book on HT, book on Indonesia, anyone